So the next presenter is Ms. Jeannie Ann Brewster. Actually, Jeannie is the CEO of the Avenues Company. She founded the Avenues about probably 20 years ago, which provides in-depth clinical and market assessments as well as product and business development support for innovations in the oral and tissue engineering and regenerative fields. So please welcome Jeannie, and we're looking forward for your talk.
Thank you.
Good, you're welcome.
All right, now it's after the break, and we get to dial down the science and talk a little bit about marketing and how to make the translation of these technologies successful in the ultimate place where you need to be, which is in the clinic. So when we were asked to talk about market trends, I, of course, immediately thought about pucks and skaters in time. I'm sure that's obvious to all of you, but the reason I thought about that is because of this. To me, the pucks and where the pucks are going is the market trend. So you need to be tuned into something that in many cases is 5+ years out, certainly for people who are faced with biologics or drug combination products, and understanding as they're moving through time where those opportunities are going to be by the time you as the champions are able to skate there is a part of the dance that makes this particular kind of venture challenging, but also a lot of fun. And the time piece obviously affects whether you arrive at the puck too soon or too late. And there are examples in this oral regenerative space of when both have happened. So that really is a measure of how well you plan and prepare to seize this opportunity down the road somewhere. Make perfect sense now why it's called Puck Skaters in Time? So even though I was really only asked to talk about where the puck is going, I'm going to talk a little bit about skating too, because I think that will whet your appetite, and my colleague here, Todd Scantlebury, I'm hoping sometime can do a workshop more on the skating aspect, some of the tools, the translational tools that you'll want to factor in now, because it is never too early to be thinking about where you're going to land in the clinic. People who do this in a sequential way and then think someday down the road they'll throw it over the wall and a marketing person will pick it up and figure that out, typically end up with a lot of fatal flaws in their design and development plans. So you can never start too soon thinking about what the clinical application will be and need is. So pucks. A few things that you might think about as you think about where the opportunities are going. So I'm not going to spend much time on this because we have lots of people in the room who are far more expert on the science and technology trends than I am. But I'm going to talk just about a few things in this space that you need to be thinking about. Certainly, we're seeing that today compared with even 5-10 years ago. The kinds of therapies that are being developed are targeting much more the underlying molecular causes than the disease symptoms. That's clearly a trend that we're going to continue to see, I'm sure, on into the future. That these biomimetic designs, even among synthetic materials now, you're seeing products being designed with the biological mechanisms driving a lot of the design features. And I think we were having a discussion during the break with regulatory people. This distinction between a biologic and a device is becoming blurrier all the time. I mean, we heard the magnesium membrane as an example, a simple, stiff, space-making membrane design out of a metal, but then there's the discussion of, is there an impact of magnesium on bone healing? And so this goes on and on with all of the materials we're working with today, even the hydroxyapatites and collagens. There are lots of ways in which there's a gray zone between biological thinking, and I think that's going to continue in the design of all of the products we're going to see going forward in this space. Clearly, the ability to be more targeted, that's not unique to the oral regeneration space, but it's certainly something that we're now capable, and we're seeing in these ITP projects a lot of examples of a more locally delivered product addresses a lot of safety issues and gets you where you need to be and not throughout the rest of the body. This idea of personalization, well, that's not fully entrenched yet in dentistry. I think it will come to. We already have a few examples in our pipeline of products that combine diagnostics with, or at least that have been submitted to the ITP groups as combinations of diagnostics with treatments. Certainly the personalization of these products is going to be, whether it's even just through risk assessments and doing a better job of figuring out who would benefit from therapies, is coming. Minimization, nanotechnology, we're seeing that all over the place here as well. And that also relates to this idea of less invasive procedures. At the clinical level as well as the scientific level, people are really looking for ways to get things done. You know, if you look at cardiovascular, for example, a lot of those things will be coming into this space as well and already have arrived that are doing things in a less invasive way. In dentistry, as in everywhere, digital robotics, 3D printing, customization. Like I say, we could probably have a workshop just talking about this and you all would have many things to add to this list, but these are the trends from a science standpoint. So you've got to be cognizant of those. A little comment on sort of evidence, and these are just a few things that I think are maybe starting to change, will be even more, have more impact in the future. Again, as the products and the mechanisms become more biomimetic, there's more biology involved, more molecular development, biomarker assays, and outcomes are going to become important, increasingly important. Imaging technologies with regenerative procedures, it's still not possible to, for example, show that you have true new periodontal attachment to a tooth without doing human histology. I would guess that we're going to see ways that that will not be necessary in the future. And as you're developing those products, that's something to think about. This is a hot thing right now with the FDA, and there's more and more products going through, even with patient-reported outcome as a major outcome in their studies and on their labels. And I think in the dental space, we've talked about a lot of things today that could benefit from patient input on what the benefits really have been to them. I mean, Steve's Lips would be a great example of that. That's a patient-reported outcome measure product if ever there was one. We have in this consortium, and in fact the chair of our clinical assessment is Mike McGuire, who runs a really high-level practice-based research network. This is, you know, a network that includes some of the best oral surgical and periodontal surgeons in the country, who are doing research that supports not just post-marketing claims and 510Ks, but PMAs, biologics. They put the first biologic through with some data that was collected from this group and universities working collaboratively, and new drug submissions. So I think the beauty of practice-based clinical research, and one of the reasons I think it was brilliant that the NIDCR asked for that to be included in this consortium, is that with many of these oral regenerative products, the ultimate customer is a practice-based clinician, and the patient populations they treat, the people they influence through the procedures they do, the way they do surgery are much more generalizable if you use them in your studies than if you go through a purely academic route and then try to bring it to that community after the fact based on data that they may have a hard time transitioning to their own practice settings. So I think it's a powerful thing, and there are other pluses as well in terms of long-term patient follow-up. These are often patients that are in the clinic, having the surgeons themselves, where there's a device that has any technique sensitivity. You can only engineer so much into the product itself. At the end of the day, the surgeon brings a lot to the table too in terms of the success of your trial. So big trend, and I think we're going to continue to see that. Related, we're seeing some of the first products, not in dental yet, but in other areas, getting significant play out of their real-world evidence, and to me that's clinical registries. The things, again, that make this a more generalizable, translatable product to the clinic. And, you know, with big data, the ability to probe big data, these registries have the potential to be a lot more powerful. So I would encourage you, early in your development to be thinking about what your registries might look like. Many products are getting approved sooner, but with the requirement that they set up registries or have those in place and monitor those after the fact. So, and we could have another session just on this. It's an interesting area as well. This probably is the one for you from a marketing standpoint that is maybe the most central take-home message from us to you, is that get really clear about who your customer is. Many of these technologies haven't yet really articulated that. And while it may be more than one and there's lots of opportunities, having a laser focus on at least one customer that is a real tangible person you can know and a group you can go to as you're thinking through the design, and not just of your early phase sort of product, but your studies, know who that customer is. For some of you, it may be specialists. For others, it may be GPs. Perhaps the real target customer isn't even in this space directly, but works in the craniofacial region. ENTs, plastics, we've seen some of that. For some of these periodontal products, it may be hygienists. And don't ignore the importance of talking to that customer if that's where you're really going. And, patients potentially they're almost always indirect customers, but would be important direct customers as well. Specialists versus generalists, we'll talk a little bit in trends about this, but there were many products going back to the early implant days when Nobel Pharma at the time launched their product, who actually narrowed their market to oral maxillofacial surgeons. They literally wouldn't sell to anybody else or train anybody else to use their products. They were that laser focused on a specialty. And we led one of those efforts when I was at Gore, where we had a guided tissue regeneration product, so just for regeneration around teeth, the first membranes, and we targeted periodontists only. Now that was some years ago. Back in the 80s, that happened. Well, today, there's a major shift that's disrupting the whole field to some degree towards the general practitioner as the ones that are doing a lot more of these regenerative procedures and implants. Whether we like it or not, that's happening. That's where the growth is in the market. You have to figure out how to walk that line. My bias, but then again, I come from the generation where we went to periodontists, and I can tell you a story about Bob Gore when that decision was made. There was a lawyer that said, you can't do that. You have to sell to all dentists. You can't just target a specialty group like that. And Bob said, tell me again, Jeannie, what do periodontists have that these general dentists don't have in terms of their extra training and understanding? And how technique sensitive is this product? When I walked him through that, he said, if I want to have a front page story in the newspaper, I want to be criticized for that, for going to that guy or gal who had all that extra expertise to make this product work, not for making this less accessible to generalists. So that was a calculated risk as a company we took then. I'm not recommending that, I'm just saying these are the decisions you're going to have to think through. Examples, though, of where GPs are going with regenerative therapies today. Many of you may be aware of these procedures, and this is just one example, that are being marketed direct to GPs. A regenerative, quote-unquote, procedure that is minimally invasive, that avoids doing complicated root coverage and grafting procedures, weekend course, and you as a general dentist never have to refer another patient to a periodontist for root coverage. You can do the pinhole technique. You run a little suture through it. So, and this is just one example of many, but it is a trend out there in the marketplace. And so as we're developing sophisticated therapies, you got to be figuring out how to navigate that one. And in implants, there's been a huge push in recent years. Some argue towards more commoditization of the implant industry, but there's, even the big players, the Straumann's, the Nobels are all getting into the value brand. They're acquiring, beginning in countries often like Brazil and, Korea, they're acquiring low-cost brands and trying to position those more for the generalists and find ways to fit that into a market that's no longer a high-value specialist niche market anymore. And that's because of the fact that's where the growth is coming from. Clearly, for some of these technologies, the oral surgeons have shown us some that are probably going to be hospital-based procedures. That's a very different environment to operate in than the private practice. The private dental practice is still in the regenerative space, largely a fee-for-service business. By the time insurance gets involved, even if it's covered, it's not going to cover much of these procedures. So you've got a whole fee-for-service environment. People coming out of medical who enter dental and try and develop products often kind of don't see that piece as clearly as they should and think that insurance is going to have a reimbursement, is going to be a big driver. It won't in that environment. But in the hospital environment, that's very different. And again, that even within private practice varies. You do have some practices, and more likely in the general dental space, that are much more insurance dependent. So understanding where you're headed there is going to be an important piece of your calculation as well. So those are all things, some of the things you have to think about relative to your customer, and I'm not finished. You also have to think about what forces are acting on them. I mean, as you're skating towards your puck, your customer is also not standing still. There are lots of forces that are acting on dentists today. They have increasing pressure to make money, whether that's through a fee-for-service model, through reimbursement. They've got to adopt procedures that are profitable to them, and they will definitely be thinking about that. Dentists are very tuned into that. Patient demands are increasingly complicated because, you know, especially in dentistry, where there's a lot of social media attention paid certainly to aesthetic outcomes and quality of life outcomes. Corporate dentistry is a big disruptor right now in the dental space. It's growing dramatically, and more dentists coming out of schools are joining these corporations. It's having a lot of impact on how specialty dentistry is, especially I think in the periodontal space, going to be structured in the future, more periodontists, rather than going into a solo or specialty practice with a referral model, or going into corporate accounts where they travel to be with the general dentist and have them available at all times. It's a different model. And a lot of that's also influenced by student debt. You have dentists coming out, was recently with actually a group of really top tier oral maxillofacial dual degree graduates who had won a prize for the regenerative research they'd done in their programs. So these are talented researchers as well. I think the minimum was $500,000 in debt. One was almost $1 million, had already started buying into a practice. You know, none of them were considering a career in academia for that reason. And all of them, after a couple of glasses of wine, admitted this was going to change the way they practiced. I mean, they're under pressure to do some things, and that's going to have an impact on the procedures that they reach for and how they operate. It's a reality. And it's also going to be probably tempered by the fact that in this environment, especially in North America, litigation and the fear of being sued is always there. And regulations, you know, whether they're up or down for a while, they're a factor too in how the customer is going to be thinking about your products when they're ready to receive these. So then there's sort of the broader market. Are you going into a developing industry? Are you creating a whole new market? I mean, some of us had the opportunity to do that. Sam Lynch is here. He did that with growth factors. We did that with membranes. There are people who are involved with implants. Maria left. She was involved with peristat. I mean, these are creating whole new markets. That's one kind of an opportunity, and it's one way to think about your build as you're developing your product and your markets. But if you're going into a more mature market, a more mature industry, which I would characterize the implant industry, certainly already it's getting there, and it will really be there by the time some of these products come into that space, the dynamics of that industry will be quite different. It affects who you might want to be thinking about as partners and ways you might think about distributing your products, so it has a lot of influence on how you do things. Again, related, is it a high-value niche? I think many of the projects we're funding are certainly targeted to be kind of high-value niche original products. But if it's more of a commodity, that requires a very different approach in dentistry. You know, the mergers and acquisitions are always happening, and in dental in the last 10 years or so, certainly 10 plus actually, orthopedics companies have come in and played a big role with technologies that have multiple indications. You know, that may influence who you think about partnering with as well. There are lots of companies out there that are doing both medical and dental now. But watching that, there's always, of course, broader economic influences. And dentistry is, a profession, especially with some of these elective procedures, that feels the market maybe a little bit more than other aspects. It's not quite as protected as other areas in healthcare. Investor experiences are important to, factor in as well. There was a period, especially with dental therapeutics, where there were a lot of high-profile failures in this space. This is a market that is much more treatment and procedure-oriented than it is prescription-oriented. So getting drugs to adopt in dentistry has been challenging. And there were some, big investments made in dental that gave dental kind of a black eye for a lot of investors. And some of you who are out there raising money are nodding. That still can be a challenge. The good news is they're coming back to the table, but you have to reflect an understanding of where those failures happened and make sure you're not repeating the same mistakes, or you'll scare these investors away. Regulatory, we'll leave that for Jeannie, but we can just say, changes are always happening. Lots of changes right now in the FDA. I mean, we're seeing a much more, in a way, open FDA than we've seen in a while, and a much more closed EMA than we've seen in a while. So for the first time in a while, European companies are even coming to the US to do their clinicals and come first to market here. For a long time, that was going the other direction. So that's something that's I wouldn't say a trend as much as it is bouncing back and forth between two poles, and you just have to kind of be cognizant of that as you're planning your clinical plan out several years. And in the rest of the world, I mean, there's emerging regulatory agencies all over the place. Japan's always been difficult. China's got some interesting things happening now. So just, you guys are thinking about regulatory now. It's never too soon to be thinking about regulatory. And I'm not even going to get into WorkFest, environment, politics, trade, healthcare reforms. I mean, all of these things are things happening out in the broader marketplace that you guys need to think about. So that's the pucks. I'm going to talk a little bit about skating. And again, this would be the topic for another workshop probably, but I want a little bit just to think about, to plant some seeds. To me, in my experience, the biggest single thing that differentiates a product that translates successfully from one that doesn't is a product that has a champion early in its development who has the ability to reach very far forward into the marketplace and very far back into the technology. So if you can span that and sort of span that valley of death with an individual who really can champion an effort and stay with that effort for a while, your probability of success goes way up. That person can't be carved out of wood. There aren't many people who have the ability to do that, but sometimes you can piece it together with a really powerful team approach as well. But you should at least have an idea about who that is. If your champion, no offense to the lab rats, but if your champion's a lab rat who never steps forward, never steps foot in the marketplace and doesn't really know who the customer is, chances are that you're going to be in that serial, sequential, left to right mode of thinking that's going to make it harder for you to be successful in translating the product to the marketplace. And this to me is another one, especially with startups and early phases. I mean, everybody gets very excited about your exit. What's your exit plan? It's one of my least favorite questions of a new project or business. Yes, if you have investors, there are people who are going to care a lot about when they're going to be able to cash in. But for you as the champion or the business leader, the driver, you should be building whatever you're building as if you're building it to last 100 years. The mindset of building something to last is so different. You'll put better people on it. You'll have a longer term horizon in terms of how you think about your endpoints. If you're building to exit, you're really at risk for building to get your FDA clearance or your FDA approval, because then you can do a big license deal and you're going to hand them something that they're not going to be able to get to adopt in the marketplace, and your ability to really capitalize on that will be jeopardized as well. So build to last. And in order to do that, you have to constantly be asking, do you have the resources you need to be successful? What I love about this consortium is it's creating access to resources for a lot of really early stage stuff that normally has a really hard time with this piece. So I think, you guys have a lot of access just through being part of the consortium. But, as you grow, you'll need to continue to ask that. And to me, another thing we certainly always think about is, again, milestones. When will we celebrate? It's really important for you and your team to have some really clear point in the future that you can sort of see when there'll be cause for celebration, and take the time to do that. It's an important thing to do it from a planning standpoint because it moves you forward. It moves you forward on a timeline. That time piece we said was important. And allows you to really think about who cares. How many stakeholders are you bringing in as you go? Who will celebrate with you? If you're in there partying all by yourself and you're 5, 6 years into a project, that's a problem. There should be people celebrating with you as you go. And this piece too, I think for early stage, when it comes especially to the customer and market knowledge, is often people developing these technologies, it's not a criticism, you just don't know what you don't know. And it's hard when you don't know what you don't know to even know what to ask for in terms of help. But it begins by being really receptive to people like me telling you that. And you'll know it's helping when you begin to know what you don't know. Because once you know what you don't know, you're fine. Then you can go out and get the resources and get going. But otherwise, you're really at risk for making some fatal mistakes. So, and one other comment on skating. No matter where you are in development, you should be thinking now more about clinical adoption than you are about technical milestones or FDA approvals. You should be thinking every day about what it is it's going to take your technology to adopt in the clinic, because you will do things differently. Technical milestones, FDA approvals, investors, strategic partners, all of those are urgent. They're the things that you have to worry about, but they're just means to that ends of having your product adopt clinically. I'll give you an example. If you're too focused on or laser focused on FDA approval, we had a discussion earlier about whether you run a periodontal therapy as an adjunct or a standalone therapy. So you probably can run a smaller study and get much cleaner data, if you're allowed to, by doing something that has just your therapy, maybe combined with SRP, whatever's optimal, compared with doing nothing. But if you go up against scaling and root planing and say that you don't need it, there are people, Maria Rines left, who worked on Periostat. That was one of the big challenges for that product. It's been true for several of the local delivery products that did not adopt. They made that fatal error. Easier FDA approval? Probably. Better data? Absolutely. Zero clinical adoption. So you don't want to take on the entire profession of dentistry and disrupt everything if you don't have to. I just wouldn't recommend it unless you're really well funded and you're going to go direct to patient and try and bypass the whole system. But I'm not going to say anything political, but that would be very disruptive. Adoption drivers in dentistry. So there's 3 things that probably these have remained true since the early days when we started first working in this space. Patients ask for it, that will drive adoption. Used to be that was impossibly expensive. I mean, to get even a 1% recognition among a consumer group was hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, Super Bowl ads, that kind of thing. So now that is a little bit more likely to happen, but you can't easily bank on it. I mean, what goes viral on social media and what might get patients to ask for something is probably not a good strategy, but you should be certainly, open to those opportunities if they materialize. In this space, a big driver for implants and biomaterials and regenerative therapies has been it's been very lucrative for dentists. And that's a reality. I mean, these are practice builders. It's the reason why GPs are not referring as much as they used to be. It's lucrative. Specialists, many of them built extremely successful practices around implants and regenerative therapies. So, if you've got a procedure or a product that is going to save the system money, and that includes the doctors making less, just be cognizant that that's going to be a challenge for you. Could be a challenge for you. Unless you have a heavy dosage of fear driving change of behavior, and that can come through, OSHA regulations changed a lot of behavior in dental practices because they had to change. So that can happen, but I would not recommend as a strategy, looking to litigation to drive adoption for your technology. I mean, that would probably not be a great strategy. So finding something that's a win-win where specialists or generalists who are going to use your product are going to also see it as a business builder. I mean, those are the best of all possible worlds. And then quickly, I want to just talk about how well do you skate? You know, this is a combination of talent, training, teamwork, embracing your mentors and your teachers. You've got lots of people around to help if you're willing to learn. This is one of my pet peeves. There are lots of landmines that have already been stepped on in this dental oral regeneration space. I mean, there have been, you know, Sam Lynch and I joked about the fact we're going to write a book together, but there are lots of mistakes that you don't need to make again. So I am a big believer in making mistakes. I think it's the absolute best way to make progress, but if at all possible, make new mistakes. There's no reason why you have to go repeat the ones that have been made by many of us in this room. Just we'll show you our scar tissue and we'll talk about it. So just avoid those landmines. You know, your facilities, your equipment, your access to capital, all of those obviously will affect how well you can skate. And then I'm just going to do a short pitch for something that, you know, I think we should probably dedicate another workshop to, and that would be a discussion about some of these tools that are available. There are lots of them out there, but, you know, some of the tools that Todd and I have used, and I think Todd should, in a future workshop, get into much more depth about this. You know, every one of these projects right now should have a very clear product concept statement. You know, a targeted product profile, a very clear description of the benefit and the unique benefit of your product that you could be putting up as the opening line of your presentations. That's a really basic tool, and there's techniques for writing those. Horizon contracts, again, you know, that's the milestones, it's the go, no goes, it's the who will celebrate with you, but you need to be sure you've got really clear horizons that direct your work in the short term, and then as you get to the next horizon, you clearly define the one after that. This method that is a somewhat more in-depth discussion around real win worth. There are other tools that do the same thing, but this is a really powerful one that gets at is the product real from a technology standpoint? Can you win? What's the likelihood it's going to succeed? And if you do, is it going to be worth anything? I mean, what's the economic picture look like? A real win worth exercise ought to be repeated pretty regularly with your teams. And then there's organizational models, fast and effective product development tools. I mean, these are all tools that ought to be in your toolbox. And I think the main point here is that you want to try and find ways to communicate internally and externally that make this very complex landscape you're skating over simpler for you and others to understand. And always remember that there should, at least in any decision you're making, be at least one person in the room who actually knows what they're talking about. I mean, that seems really basic, but when Bob Gore came to a meeting, we did a lot of team decision making at Gore, and pulled me aside and said, next time, just one person. It's great you're all engaged in this decision, but one person who knows what they're talking about. If you're having a meeting and you're getting really into regulatory strategy and everybody's got a great idea and the other genie is not in the room, that's a problem. So people, especially, I love you scientists, but scientists have a tendency, because you're really smart and you're really capable of learning lots of new things, to think that you can learn it all and you can bring all of that to a discussion and a decision. God bless you, but it's not true. Get an expert in the room who actually knows what they're talking about. And you will learn more that way and you'll make better decisions. All right, quickly on time, because obviously the trajectory of the puck and the pace at which you're skating will influence whether this goes forward anymore. And it's not, so I don't know if that's a fatal flaw. Well, maybe we're almost out of time. I think the thing I was going to say about time is that investors have told me that one of the things that that puts projects that are driven by high science and by teams of scientists most at risk is that scientists are terrific at lots of things, but they're not very good at predicting how long things will take. And it's the nature of science. I mean, science doesn't work to the clock, right? It takes you in all kinds of different directions. So the people who are pretty good at timelines and projecting out timelines tend to be your accountants, your finance people in general, your regulatory people. You know, the wet blankets, talk to the wet blankets. Because you may have a vision of what it is you're trying to do, and you may even have a decent plan, but chances are that timeline, which is the difference between a successful intervention with the puck and an unsuccessful one, is going to be wrong if you're not getting the people involved in that discussion who are going to be somewhat skeptical about the optimism. If you're in a bigger organization, the other people you don't ever want to bring into the room are the salespeople. I mean, it's because they're going to tell you we'll have it tomorrow, right? I mean, scientists and salespeople are notoriously not great at predicting how long things will take. And all of your plans and your success will hinge on getting that timing right. In this space, because it's not always under your control, time is often influenced greatly by forces outside of your lab, like the FDA. It's really important when it comes to time that you have good contingency plans. And again, there's lots of tools for that, but you've got to be recognizing that if you get delayed certain periods of time, things change about the opportunity, the customer, and your skating may have to be adapted to accommodate that. So I think that's all I was going to say about time, but thank you. I'm out of time, so. Questions? Or?
Yeah, thank you, Jeannie. That was fantastic. Really, helping us understand, a lot of the approaches that we need to be implementing early on. I was going to ask you, as we look at this field of regenerative dentistry and what we're doing as a part of this consortium, you mentioned as we examine the landscape and the challenges of these technologies actually have a significant cost burden, right? Looking to we're talking about new drugs, devices, biologics. And what is your view in terms of, how these can eventually be adopted? I know this is not an easy question, but if we look at the example of, Medtronic and Infuse, great technology, but for that to be adopted, more broadly in dentistry, it just didn't work because of the structure. What's some of the advice that you can give, and now that you've seen a lot of our projects going through, they're not going to be inexpensive. I think we see some of those. And so what are some general guidelines and directions you can give?
I think that it's not an easy question to answer, but I think clearly it begins with the market assessment about the indication and opportunities you're targeting. I mean, Infuse is an example of that. I think that the technology had great results, but it was probably overkill for a lot of basic, everyday dental regenerative, bone regenerative procedures. So the market really wasn't all bone regeneration. If it had been, and the value had really been able to be demonstrated there, they'd probably still be a big player in dental, but it was a very limited number of procedures where that was really, that extra horsepower was needed. And we can go into the other issues. There were also obviously other issues with it. That's one issue. The other lesson I think specifically can learn from Infuse, and it's pertinent to your project, Will, is that if you're going to be in a pricing model that's being dictated by something other than the dental market, the fee-for-service market, the indication and the value that you're offering in the market here that you're targeting, if you're going to be forced to price something as BMP was by a spine indication that's reimbursed that has a very different value proposition, that can be a showstopper for a dental indication. And some of that is, driven by your cost of manufacturing, your cost of goods. I mean, if you're also in a place where you have no choice, that you need to understand pretty early on and decide whether this is a good indication to go after. But some of it is just by not being if you're selling the same widget in two markets, you know, and you're going to price it for the higher valued one, that, you know, that's a problem. So there are strategies that are pretty, you know, that are pertinent for several of you about thinking about your end run indication, targeting something where there's going to be enough value, enough volume, and the price differential between the cost of goods, because the cost of marketing a new technology and sales in this market is substantial. I mean, when, you know, Nobel and Pharma and Gore first went out, we were over 100% of the cost was sales. And you start getting profitable when you get down to maybe 50%. But it's a hard market to reach in some respects. It's very decentralized. So you have to factor all that in. You need a cost of goods that makes sense, and a target and a value in that target and volume.
And then maybe as a follow-up to that, looking at the environment, you talked about, you know, new practitioners coming out with huge debts, less referrals going out, and, you know, trying to keep that in and wanting to have more and more technologies as commodities. Is that creating a bigger challenge right now, or do you see other, you know, opportunities where practices really want to distinguish themselves to showcase that they're delivering the most cutting edge, innovative type of care?
You know, it needs to be real, Will. That's probably the biggest thing I would say. Is part of the commoditization is that the performance differentials just aren't great enough, and the pricing differences can be quite significant. So from a business standpoint, dentists make decisions to go with low priced commodity type products. If you're really providing a true performance advantage and you have a value argument, whether it's saving time, it's less morbidity, I mean, you have a compelling value argument, and at the same time can differentiate practitioners who use this and make it work, those can all be great drivers for adoption. It comes back to that docs make money. I mean, that is partly having a reputation in your community that brings referrals in. And I think specialists in particular, the ones that are going to survive, are going to have to be really special. Right? I mean, you can't call yourself one unless you're doing something now that GPs don't at least think they can do. So.
That was a great talk. I could have listened for another hour or two, maybe another time. Question about, you mentioned patient-reported outcomes at the beginning. Yeah. In the drug industry, those can be very powerful tools because you've got good placebo control. But in this environment, in some clinical trials, placebo control is not very practical or not very well controlled. Right. Are PROs just as valuable? Will they show up on your product label if you don't have, you know, a blinded control group?
Yeah. So McGuire Institute's not here representing themselves today, but they just fairly recently, Paul published a study using PROS in dentistry for a root coverage material that had the benefit to the patients that you didn't have to go to the autogenous site, and these can be quite painful. So again, a patient-reported outcome is probably more powerful a driver for the benefit of that product than maybe a couple of millimeters of additional root coverage or whatever. So that's a big driver in that particular. And yes, that from the discussions we've had with the FDA, Jeannie could speak to that, but as long as they're done in a very scientific way, and this is not easy. I mean, I think Geishlich sponsored that study, and I don't remember it was not cheap. They brought in a top-tier social scientist from Brown University who specializes in PROS, has done a lot of it for the pharmaceutical, had to design tools that would stand scrutiny. And it can't be just a dentist saying, how did that feel? Were you in less pain? Because it turns out patients will tell their dentist whatever they think their dentist wants to hear, and there's all kinds of complications to that. It has to be often real time, so it was calls every hour for several hours after surgery. So it can be done, and I think there are other examples of companies looking to integrate that in their labels. I think for dentistry, where patients make, you know, a personal investment decision often, and where pain and beauty are kind of two factors that often do play into some of these procedures, patient-reported outcomes probably do have a big role to play in the future. Joe?
Oh, sorry. No, the workforce changed. The mid-level practitioner, you know, is going to come into the dental space, probably sooner than we think.
Yeah.
And a lot of the things we talked about today and a lot of things that are out on the market, how do you think regulations will be? Can a mid-level practitioner who's going to cut teeth, there'll be a master treatment planner in an office and some, non-dental degreed individual making crowns, cutting crown preps, impressions. How do you see the space sort of flushing out in terms from a regulatory point of view? Do you think states will allow someone to use, augmentation product? I think to me that's a big sea change in the dental. If you are a DSO, you're going to have a master treatment planner and a whole bunch of sort of mid-level practitioners.
Yeah.
Taking the easy tooth out, doing the easy endo, doing a crown, doing a 3-unit bridge.
So I guess what I would say, and I would begin by saying I'm definitely not an expert on that, and that might be actually a good topic for a workshop in the future too, to really understand that better. What my experience has been at the state level, well, and at the national level, dentists are fairly well organized and quite protective of the special things they're allowed to do. And I mean, Jed probably has something to say about this too. And they resist a lot of those changes and can organize around preventing that from happening quickly, even if that's what a DSO organization would love to see. So I don't think it's going to happen overnight. But in terms of where the puck's going, certainly we've seen it already. Hygienists, will continue to organize around doing more and more things. General dentists are taking on more that specialists used to do. So these mid-level people are going to emerge. I don't know the answer, Joe, but I think there'll be things in place that will resist that change. There's a lot invested in the status quo, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen.
Jeannie.
Yes. Oh, hi, Greg. Where are you?
Hi. I don't know if you can hear me. This is Greg Bosch. Thanks. Excellent presentations, and it's been wonderful to listen. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. I think it'd be helpful to get your perspective on how these emerging technologies can be levered between orthopedics and dental, as we've talked so much, whether it's hard or soft tissue overlaps in these areas. And quite candidly, a lot of times the dental application's right on the back of the orthopedic application. And you see so many new technologies, or perhaps wound care, like the Gentuit product, BMP in orthopedics, and MDGain, which is specifically dental. It seems like they struggle in the dental franchise, but if they can get leverage and revenue and adoption through some of the larger players in orthopedics, it ultimately benefits the dental franchise and dental clinician. Can you speak to that at all?
Then I'm looking straight at Sam Lynch, because I think Sam might have some thoughts on this too, having developed a product that's been in both spaces. The thing I would say is that the idea, at least in theory, of being able to go in, depending on your technology, to a dental market, if you can get there quickly enough relative to the marketing piece, and that might be a partnering strategy, is that the reimbursement hurdle doesn't have to be cleared. So, perhaps sometimes the regulatory also is a little bit easier. The risk is lower. There aren't as many concerns about patient safety in some cases. So dental can be, I think a lot of those companies thought it would be a good place to go first. And of course for, membranes and dental implants and the xenografts you work with, Greg, the dental industry proved to be a great place to land. Very profitable. So it's not a bad strategy to use that, and there are examples of where that's then segued into orthopedics. If you're dealing with something where, again, your pricing and other constraints are going to be defined by your orthopedic opportunity, you might be better off just not even investing in the dental part and seeing that as an off-label when somebody's highly motivated. Because I think you're going to be in a tough spot if it's the exact same product and you're selling into ridge augmentation, the same product that's being used for spine. But do you want to say something, Sam, about that too? Do you have any thoughts?
Well, maybe just a couple of quick observations. First, let me say, it certainly was my experience. I think the folks in this room and scientists in the dental craniofacial regeneration space in general, and I would add to that immunology and probably many other fields, are every bit or more scientifically trained and better, honestly, than the orthopedic surgeons are. So first of all, I would say y'all should never take a back seat to any orthopedic surgeon or any dermatologist or vascular surgeon or anybody treating these chronic wounds in skin, because you have as much training as or more than they do. And you probably understand, honestly, the biology better than they do. So I think there's a huge role for people like that are in this room to advance science and advance translational medicine outside of dentistry. That would be first and foremost based on my firsthand experience. Secondly, absolutely, orthopedics is 10 times the larger market than dentistry for most products, maybe 100 times in some cases. So it's very product specific. I don't know that membranes ever caught on in orthopedics, right? BioOS and the bovine xenografts we talked about last night never have caught on in orthopedics. We were able to take PDGF, arguably some people would say not nearly as effective as BMP, potentially in big orthopedic defects, but we were able to develop 2 PMA products in orthopedics based on that technology, sold the company for $400 million, right? So it's very product specific. I think some of the technologies that have been presented here this morning absolutely could be taken into medical indications extremely successfully. Others, not so much. So you just have to really parse out what your technology is, what the indications are, and where you think your niche is.
Okay.
Those on the web, we were taking a break until 12:30. We will resume the webinar at that time.